This is Brother Michael Diamond with Brother Peter Diamond, vaticancatholic.com. We will be looking at Benedict XVI's recent statements, which are made in a new book called Light of the World, the Pope, the Church, and the Signs of the Times. And on pages 117 through 119 in Chapter 11, Benedict XVI is asked the following questions about condom use. The author of this book-length interview book states to Benedict XVI the following question. He says, quote, "In Africa you stated that the Church's traditional teaching has proven to be the only sure way to stop the spread of HIV. Critics, including critics from the Church's own ranks, object that it is madness to forbid a high-risk population to use condoms." Benedict XVI responds by saying, quote, "The media coverage completely ignored the rest of the trip to Africa on account of a single statement." He goes on to say, "In my remarks, I was not making a general statement about condom use, but merely said, and this is what caused such great offense, that we cannot solve the problem by distributing condoms." And he goes on to say, "There may be a basis in the case of some individuals, as perhaps when a male prostitute uses a condom, where this can be a first step in the direction of a moralization, a first assumption of responsibility on the way toward recovering an awareness that not everything is allowed and that one cannot do whatever one wants. But it is not really the way to deal with the evil of HIV infection. That can really lie only in a humanization of sexuality." The author then says, quote, "Are you saying then that the Catholic Church is not actually opposed in principle to the use of condoms?" Benedict XVI responds to this, quote, "She of course does not regard it as a real or moral solution, but in this or that case, there can be nonetheless, in the intention of reducing the risk of infection, a first step in a movement toward a different way, a more human way of living sexuality," end quote.
And so people have tried to explain this away, and we're going to look at these words in detail and show that Benedict XVI is without any question justifying condom use. And in the process of trying to explain these words away, numerous defenders of the Vatican II Church have fallen into heretical and illogical arguments. And the clincher, there are actually a number of statements in here that constitute the clincher.
Well, the first thing is that he says at the beginning here, when the first question is asked, "In Africa you stated that the Church's traditional teaching has proven to be the only sure way of stopping the spread of HIV. Critics, including critics from the Church's own ranks, object that it is madness to forbid a high-risk population to use condoms." He immediately responds to that by saying the media coverage completely ignored the rest of the trip to Africa on account of a single statement. So you can see right here at the beginning that he's not saying, "No, I'm saying this is forbidden at all times." He's saying that there could be something more to this, that maybe there is an allowance in certain situations. And so then at the end, of course, and this is the critical part of it, he says there may be a basis in the case of some individuals.
And the key here is a lot of people have tried to explain this away by saying that he's talking about the lesser of two evils, and we will discuss some details about that. But the key here is that the original question concerned Seewald's statement that, quote, "It is madness to forbid a high-risk population to use condoms." That's the subject here, using condoms. And so when he says there may be a basis in the case of some individuals, a basis for what? To use condoms.
So this isn't an issue about the lesser of two evils.
No, they've totally tried to spin this into a discussion of what evil is worse. No, the subject here is whether condoms can be used. And he doesn't say no, he says there may be a basis. And what further confirms this and blows their arguments out of the water is the next statement. Seewald follows it up to clarify. He gives them a chance to back out of what he has already said. He says, are you saying then that the Catholic Church is actually not opposed in principle to the use of condoms? Any Catholic would simply say, no, I'm not saying that. It is opposed in principle. What does he say? Quote, she of course does not regard it as a real or moral solution, but in this or that case, there can be nonetheless, in the intention of reducing the risk of infection, a first step in a movement toward a different way, a more human way of living sexuality. So, he doesn't say no because he's saying that in some cases you can use condoms. Period.
That's quite clear. So what we have happening here, and in fact actually CNN's John Allen, their senior Vatican correspondent, he responded to the remarks of Benedict XVI by stating that this is similar to a 2006 Vatican commission that said condom use is justifiable among heterosexuals, where the primary purpose is not to prevent conception, but to prevent disease. And so what you have actually happening here is the overturning, or attempted overturning, of the Church's teaching that conception cannot be thwarted by any direct action. And so this is something that's completely different. Now the main evil, according to Benedict XVI, is spreading disease that may be deadly. That has now taken the number one spot over preventing conception as being the worst evil. And so now preventing disease is number one, and preventing conception is number two. And this is actually clarified, this point, and we'll get to Father Lombardi, but also the Monsignor at the Vatican's Bioethics Advisory Board, he was quoted in the Telegraph. He says, quote, contraception is not the worst evil. The Church does not see it as a good, but the Church does not see it as the worst. Abortion is far worse. Passing on HIV is criminal. That is absolute irresponsibility, end quote.
And I think we should introduce this by pointing out that when this first occurred, a lot of the defenders of the Vatican II Church tried to explain it away by saying that Benedict XVI is only talking about a homosexual male prostitute engaged in abominable homosexual acts, okay? And so that's what they all ran to as their defense in order to try to explain these statements away, that, well, since this homosexual act cannot produce life, then the use of the condom is actually not directly destroying or preventing life. And so in that case, he's expressing a conscience by choosing not to infect the person he's engaging in this abomination with. But that was dishonest, number one, because Benedict XVI's original statement did not say that it only applied to homosexual acts. He described a male prostitute, and a male prostitute could refer to a heterosexual encounter. And secondly, even when he's talking about the male prostitute, he does not say that what he articulates applies exclusively to the male prostitute. So it was dishonest, and then it was destroyed about 2 days later when Father Lombardi, the head of the Vatican's press office, he came out with this statement in which he said that he talked to Benedict XVI, and Benedict XVI was not just talking about homosexual acts. He says, I personally asked, quote, the Pope, if there was a serious important problem in the choice of the masculine over the feminine. He told me no. The problem is this, and he goes on, this is if you're a woman, a man, or a transsexual. So he's applying this statement to anybody. Okay, so the first line of defense, that he's only talking about homosexual acts, and this kind of defense was made by the Novus Ordo Apostate, apostle of natural family planning, Janet Smith. She said that he's only talking about homosexuals. Completely wrong. Other people argue that as well. And once that was refuted, now they've come up with a new excuse, which is that, well, he's not justifying condoms. He's not saying that using condoms is good or acceptable, which is untrue because we discussed and looked at his comments. But he's just saying that it's the lesser evil, and that's actually also what the Vatican came out and clarified. Lombardi says in his clarification, quote, but maintains that the use of a condom, referring to Benedict XVI, to diminish the danger of infection may be a first assumption of responsibility, a first step in a movement toward a more human sexuality, as opposed to not using the condom. Okay, so now this is their other defense, that he's not saying condom use is okay, he's just saying that if you use it in the case in which if you didn't use it you would give someone a disease, to use it expresses a better intention and is less evil.
And he mentions if you are a woman, a man, or transsexual.
And so they're saying that to use the condom and not give this person the disease is less evil than possibly preventing life. This isn't even logical, okay? When someone has unprotected sex with a disease, they're simply risking transmitting a disease to another. But if you use a condom, you're risking preventing a new life. So what's worse, depriving someone of life or possibly making someone's life worse? Obviously, depriving them of life altogether is worse. Furthermore, he says that this is the first step in a movement toward a more human sexuality, as opposed to not using the condom. This is directly heretical, because Pope Pius XI, in Casta Connubii, 1930 encyclical on these issues, he says, no reason, however grave, may be put forward by which anything intrinsically against nature, in other words, using a condom, may become conformable to nature and morally good. And he goes on to say, therefore, the conjugal act is destined primarily by nature for the begetting of children. Those who, in exercising it, deliberately frustrate its natural powers and purpose, sin against nature, and commit a deed which is shameful and intrinsically vicious. So it's inhuman, it's intrinsically vicious, and it's shameful. They're saying that to use a condom to prevent disease is actually human, and the first step in the movement toward a more human sexuality. It's completely wrong. And what's interesting is that these false traditionists, this Father Fessio, who was involved with Benedict XVI and has published a lot of his material, he actually, in pathetically trying to defend anti-Pope Benedict XVI on this condom issue, first went to it only applies to the homosexuals, then that was shot down by Lombardi. Then he went to that, well, they are only saying that it's the lesser evil, and I want to quote him here. He says, referring to heterosexual acts, okay, and trying to explain Benedict XVI's statements, he says, quote, performing that act with a condom may be a lesser evil than performing it without one. That's completely wrong.
And there you go. This is therefore saying that giving someone a deadly disease is the worst evil.
It's worse than preventing life.
Yes, and that's clear. And so that's where we are with this statement, that the lesser of the evils is
to not give the person the disease. It's worse to give them the disease than to prevent a life. And
also, going back to this issue about it's only applying to a homosexual, first of all, male prostitute, the definition for it, is not exclusively males with males. That's a fact. And secondly, in this statement he says, quote, there may be a basis in the case of some individuals as perhaps. So you can see he's just giving an example that could be one of many.
That example was no doubt chosen deliberately by the diabolical intelligence guiding him, because then the people would try to explain it away by confusing people that he's only talking about homosexual acts, but in reality he isn't.
And Benedict XVI approved of all the translations in different languages of this book. He personally approved of them. John Allen said that on CNN. People are just reading the statements. We just read his statements out of this book, which he fully approved of and looked over the translation, for example, in the English language.
And that's a key point. So if people try to resort to different languages to say, well, you didn't really mean that, don't fall for it, because Benedict XVI personally went over with his good friend Peter Seewald these translations, and he approved exactly what was released. He knew all about it. He wanted this released.
And then at the end, of course, as we quoted earlier, when he says, are you saying then that the Catholic Church is not opposed in principle to the use of condoms? He says, she, of course, does not regard it as a real or moral solution, but in this or that case, there can be nonetheless, in the intention of reducing the risk of infection, a first step in a movement towards a different way, a more human way of living sexuality. So therefore, he could issue a yes or no there. He could say, no, the Church would never allow the use of condoms. He doesn't say that he says that if it's done to prevent infection, that it can be justified. That's clear.